High in the attic of Prague's old new synagogue, there is a door that has been sealed for centuries. Behind it, in the darkness and dust, something waits, or so the legend says. The synagogue itself is ancient. Built in 1270, it is the oldest active synagogue in all of Europe. Its stones have witnessed 800 years of prayer, of joy, of sorrow, and of secrets. But no secret is darker or more enduring than what is said to rest in that forbidden attic. The stairs that lead up have been removed. The door has been locked and sealed by rabbinical decree. No one is permitted to enter. No one is permitted to see what lies beyond. The people of Prague's Jewish quarter still whisper about it. They say that in the shadows above their heads, covered in centuries of dust, there is a figure made of clay, a creature that was never born and can never truly die. They call it the Golem. Now, let us go back through the centuries, back to a spring night in the 1590s, when the narrow streets of Prague's Jewish quarter, the Josephov ghetto, are filled with a different kind of whisper. Not the whisper of old legend, but the whisper of fresh terror. A mob is gathering. There are perhaps 50 men, maybe more. They carry torches that turn their faces into masks of orange and shadow. Their voices are growing louder, more confident, more cruel. They are shouting accusations. A Christian child has gone missing, they say, and they know who is responsible. The Jews, those Christ killers, those demons in human skin who steal children for their dark rituals. It is a lie. It has always been a lie. But truth does not matter when a mob has formed. The Jews of the quarter can hear them coming. Mothers pull their children inside. Fathers bar the doors and pray. The elderly, who have lived through this before, begin to recite the Shema, the final prayer a Jew speaks before death. They know what comes next: the breaking of doors, the flames, the screaming, the blood running in the gutters like rainwater. But tonight, something is different. The mob reaches the edge of the ghetto, the narrow entrance where the Christian city meets the Jewish world, and there, blocking the way, is a figure. It is huge, easily 7 feet tall, perhaps taller. Its body is broad and powerful, its limbs thick as tree trunks. But the strangest thing, the most unnatural thing, is its face, or rather, the absence of one. The features are crude, unfinished, as if the sculptor had given up halfway through. The eyes are shallow dents. The mouth is a simple line. It is the face of a thing that should not be alive, but is. And on its forehead, glowing faintly in the torchlight, is a word carved in Hebrew letters, AMT, Emet, truth. The mob stops. The shouting dies in their throats. They stare at this impossible thing, this creature that looks like it was pulled from the earth itself, and a cold terror grips them. One of the torches falls from nerveless fingers and sputters in the mud. The golem does not speak. It cannot speak, but it takes one single step forward, and the sound of its foot striking the cobblestones is like thunder. The mob breaks. They scatter like leaves in a storm, tripping over each other in their desperation to flee. In seconds, the street is empty, except for the abandoned torches, still burning in the darkness. And the golem stands alone, a silent guardian at the gates of the Jewish quarter. Inside, Behind locked doors, hundreds of people breathe again. They are safe for tonight. But here is the question that echoes down through the centuries, the question we must answer tonight. Who created this creature, and why? What kind of desperation, what kind of terror would drive a holy man, a scholar, a rabbi, to break the laws of God and nature, to bring life to lifeless clay? Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the mysteries of our past should not be lost, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will unlock the sealed attic. We will trace the legend of the Golem back to its roots in real history, to a community facing genocide, to a rabbi caught between faith and desperation, and to an ancient mystical tradition that promised humans could do what only God should do: create life from dust. This is not just a fairy tale. It is not just folklore. It is the story of what happens when good people are pushed to the absolute edge. It is the story of protection that becomes destruction. It is the original tale of the creation that turns on its creator, the template for Frankenstein and every monster story that followed. To understand how the Golem was born, we must first understand the city of shadows that demanded its creation, a city where Jews lived in constant fear, a city where, at any moment, a lie could become a massacre, a city called Prague. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Prague in the late 16th century was a city of contradictions. It was a jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, a center of art, science, and learning. The Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II had made it his capital, and he filled his court with alchemists, astrologers, and scholars from across Europe. It was a city obsessed with unlocking the secrets of the universe, with transmuting base metal into gold, with discovering the hidden knowledge of the ancients. But beneath this glittering surface of Renaissance enlightenment, there was a much darker world. And nowhere was that darkness deeper than in the Jewish quarter, the ghetto known as Josefov. The word ghetto itself comes from the Jewish quarters of European cities. It sounds almost neutral today, a simple description of a neighborhood. But in the 16th century, a ghetto was not a neighborhood. It was a prison, a cage designed to contain and control a population that the Christian majority both needed and despised. The Jewish quarter of Prague was a warren of narrow, winding streets, barely wide enough for two people to pass each other. The buildings were tall and pressed close together, blocking out the sun, so that even at midday, the streets lived in perpetual twilight. There were only a handful of entrances, and at night, these were locked with heavy chains and guarded. Jews could not leave after dark. They could not own land outside the quarter. They could not practice most professions. They were trapped. And yet, life continued. Jewish Prague was a world unto itself, a community that had learned to survive in the cracks and shadows of Christian Europe. The streets might have been dark, but they hummed with life. Children played in the alleys, women went to the market, men walked to the synagogue for prayer, their black coats and beards marking them as different, as other, as perpetually foreign, no matter how many generations their families had lived in Prague. The synagogue, the old new synagogue, was the heart of this world. It was already 300 years old by the time our story begins, its Gothic arches rising like stone trees, its walls thick enough to survive anything. Inside, men gathered 3 times a day to pray, to study the Talmud, to debate the fine points of Jewish law. This was a community of scholars, of thinkers, of people who believed that study and learning were the highest forms of worship. But no amount of prayer could protect them from the world outside. Because the Christian majority did not just despise Jews, they feared them. And fear mixed with religious hatred is one of the most dangerous forces in human history. The Christians of Prague and of all Europe had been taught from childhood that the Jews were demons in human form, that they were the killers of Christ, cursed by God to wander the earth until they finally accepted the truth of Christianity, that they possessed dark powers, practiced black magic, and were in league with the devil himself. But of all the terrible lies told about Jews, none was more deadly than the blood libel. The blood libel was a specific, monstrous accusation that Jews kidnapped Christian children, murdered them, and used their blood in religious rituals. The most common version claimed that Jews needed Christian blood to make matzah, the unleavened bread eaten during Passover. It was complete nonsense, of course. Jewish law strictly forbids the consumption of any blood. And the idea of human sacrifice is absolutely contrary to everything Judaism teaches. But it did not matter that it was a lie. People believed it, and they acted on it. The pattern was always the same. A Christian child would go missing or be found dead, usually the victim of accident, illness, or sometimes a Christian murderer. But instead of looking for the real explanation, the local population would blame the Jews. A mob would form. They would storm the Jewish quarter, break down doors, drag people into the streets. Men would be beaten to death. Women would be violated. Children would be murdered in front of their parents. Houses would be looted and burned. And when it was over, when the streets ran red and the ghetto lay in ruins, the authorities would shrug and say the Jews had brought it on themselves. After all, everyone knew what they were capable of. This had happened again and again across Europe for centuries. In 1144 in Norwich, England, a boy named William was found dead, and the Jews were accused. In 1171 in Blois, France, an entire Jewish community, 31 men, women, and children, were burned alive based on nothing but accusation. In 1475 in Trent, Italy, a boy named Simon went missing, and the Jewish community was tortured until they confessed to murdering him in a ritual. 15 Jews were executed, and Simon was made a saint. The Catholic Church would not officially remove his sainthood until 1965. These were not rare events. They were a constant, recurring nightmare. And by the late 16th century, the Jews of Prague knew their history. They knew the pattern. They knew that at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, the next accusation could come. And when it did, there would be nothing they could do to stop what followed. They could not defend themselves physically. Jewish law forbade them from carrying weapons, and even if it did not, fighting back against a Christian mob would only prove that they were violent criminals. It would give the authorities an excuse to wipe out the entire community. They could not appeal to the law. Jews had almost no legal rights. Their testimony was not accepted in Christian courts. Even if a Jew could prove his innocence beyond any doubt, it often did not matter. The mob wanted blood, and the authorities were happy to give it to them. They could not flee. Where would they go? Every city in Europe had its ghetto, its blood libels, its pogroms. There was no safe place for Jews in Christendom. All they could do was pray. Pray that this year the accusations would not come. Pray that if they did come, some miracle would turn the mob away. Pray that God, who had protected their ancestors through so many trials, would protect them one more time. But by the 1590s, the pressure on Prague's Jewish community was reaching a breaking point. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing, with the Catholic Church trying to stamp out any hint of Protestant heresy and reassert its absolute authority. Jews, as always, made convenient scapegoats. Economic competition between Christian and Jewish merchants was creating resentment. Superstition and fear were spreading like a plague, and there had been close calls. Accusations that were investigated and dismissed, but only barely. Mobs that formed and were dispersed by authorities, but only at the last moment. Each time, the community breathed a sigh of relief and thanked God for their deliverance. But each time, they also knew the next time they might not be so lucky. In the homes of the Jewish quarter, parents held their children a little tighter. The elderly, who remembered past horrors, grew quieter and more fearful. Young men looked at the locked gates and wondered if they would become tombs. And the women, as they lit the Sabbath candles each Friday evening, prayed with a desperate intensity that God would watch over them, would protect them, would not let them be slaughtered like animals. They were a community living under a sword that hung by the thinnest of threads. They were people who went to bed each night, not knowing if they would wake to screams and fire. They were trapped in a cage, surrounded by enemies, with no way out and no way to fight back. And so they turned to the one man they believed might have an answer, a scholar, a mystic, a rabbi whose wisdom was said to reach beyond the ordinary world into the hidden realms of divine knowledge. They turned to the man they called the Maharal, the Exalted One. They turned to Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel. And Rabbi Loew, alone in his study late at night, stared at the ancient books spread before him and wrestled with an impossible question. If God will not send a miracle to save us, is it permitted for a man to create one himself? To understand Rabbi Judah Loew, the man who would create the Golem, you must first understand what he was not. He was not a magician. He was not a sorcerer or a wizard from a children's story, waving a wand and speaking in mystical gibberish. He was not a charlatan or a con artist, deceiving people with tricks and illusions. Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel was one of the greatest Jewish scholars of his age. He was a Talmudic genius, a philosopher, an educator, and a community leader. He was a man whose writings on Jewish law and ethics are still studied today, more than 400 years after his death. He was respected not only by Jews, but by Christian scholars as well. Legend says that even Emperor Rudolph II sought him out for private conversations, drawn by the rabbi's wisdom and learning. He was born sometime between 1512 and 1520, the exact date is uncertain, into a distinguished family of scholars. His early years were spent in intense study, mastering the Torah, the Talmud, and the vast ocean of Jewish legal and philosophical literature. By the time he arrived in Prague in the 1570s to become the chief rabbi of the Jewish community, he was already famous as a teacher and a thinker. But what made him truly extraordinary, what set him apart from other scholars, was his interest in what Jews call Kabbalah, the hidden wisdom, the mystical tradition. Kabbalah is not magic, though outsiders often mistake it for such. It is an esoteric interpretation of Jewish scripture, a system of thought that seeks to understand the fundamental nature of God, creation, and the universe. It deals with questions that cannot be answered by logic alone. How did the infinite God create a finite universe? How do divine emanations flow through the cosmos? What is the hidden meaning behind every word, every letter of the Torah? To study Kabbalah was to walk a dangerous path. It required years of preparation, intense discipline, and a deep grounding in conventional Jewish study. The rabbis warned that those who entered this garden of mystical knowledge too young or unprepared could lose their minds, their faith, or their souls. There were famous stories of 4 rabbis who entered the mystical realm. One died, one went mad, one became a heretic, and only one, Rabbi Akiva, emerged intact. But for those who were prepared, Kabbalah offered something extraordinary: the possibility of understanding the very mechanism of creation itself. And that is where the Golem enters the story. Because buried deep in the Kabbalistic tradition, there is a text called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. It is one of the oldest works of Jewish mysticism, written perhaps as early as the 2nd century. And it describes, in cryptic and poetic language, how God created the universe. According to the Sefer Yetzirah, God did not create through force or will alone. God created through language, through combinations of Hebrew letters and divine names. The letters themselves are not just symbols, they are the building blocks of reality. Each letter carries divine energy. Each combination creates a different aspect of existence. God spoke, and in speaking the right combinations, brought the universe into being from nothing. And then comes the critical passage. The Sefer Yetzirah states that human beings, if they understand these combinations, if they know the right names and the right rituals, can replicate, on a much smaller scale, the act of creation itself. Specifically, they can create a golem. The word golem appears in the Bible only once, in Psalm 139, where it means something like unformed substance or embryo. But in the Jewish mystical tradition, a golem came to mean something very specific: an artificial human being, created from clay or dust through Kabbalistic ritual. The tradition speaks of several famous rabbis who were said to have created golems. These were not dark sorceries or demon summonings. They were acts of profound spiritual achievement, demonstrations that the rabbi had achieved such understanding of the divine secrets that he could mirror in the tiniest way God's original creation of Adam from the dust of the earth. But these golems were always imperfect. They could not speak. They had no true soul, no free will, no moral sense. They were automatons, powerful, obedient, but ultimately just animated clay. And crucially, the tradition emphasized that creating a golem was a feat to be attempted only by the most righteous and knowledgeable of scholars, and even then, only as a spiritual exercise, never for practical use. Because to create life, even this crude imitation of life, was to step into territory that belonged to God alone. Rabbi Loew knew all of this. He had studied the Sefer Yetzirah. He understood the theological implications. He knew the warnings. And under normal circumstances, he would never have considered such a thing. The creation of a golem was a matter for theoretical study, not practical application. But these were not normal circumstances. It was the spring of 1590, or perhaps 1591. The legends differ on the exact year. Rabbi Loew was now in his 70s, an old man by the standards of his time. He had led the Prague Jewish community for more than a decade, and those years had been marked by increasing tension and fear. He was not just a scholar in an ivory tower. He was a shepherd, responsible for the physical and spiritual well-being of thousands of souls. And every day, he felt the weight of that responsibility crushing down on him like a physical burden. When he walked through the streets of the Jewish quarter, people stopped him constantly. They asked for his advice, his blessing, his intervention in disputes. But more and more, what he saw in their eyes was fear. The young mothers who clutched their children a little too tightly when Christian visitors passed through the quarter. The old men who flinched at sudden noises, remembering pogroms from their youth. The community leaders who came to him late at night, their faces grey with worry, to report another close call, another accusation that was narrowly avoided. Every Shabbat, Rabbi Loew stood before his congregation in the old new synagogue. The sanctuary would be packed, every seat filled, men standing in the back when there was no more room. And he would preach words of faith and hope, reminding them that God had always protected the Jewish people, that no matter how dark the times, morning would come. But afterward, when the congregation had filed out and he was alone in the synagogue, he would sit in the silence and ask himself, "Do I believe the words I just spoke? Or am I simply telling them what they need to hear?" Because the truth was that Rabbi Loew, for all his faith and learning, was afraid. He was afraid because he knew the history. He had studied the accounts of the massacres in Blois, in Trent, in dozens of other cities. He knew how these things unfolded. He knew that once a mob formed, once the accusation was made, nothing could stop it. Not reason, not evidence, not the truth. The mob had its own terrible logic, and it always ended the same way, with Jewish blood. He was afraid because he could see the signs, the increasing hostility from Christian preachers, the economic resentment, the wild rumors spreading through the Christian quarters of Prague. He could feel it building like a storm on the horizon, dark clouds gathering, the air heavy with the promise of violence. And he was afraid because he knew he was powerless to stop it. What could he do? He was an old rabbi, a scholar, a man of books and prayer. He had no weapons, no soldiers, no political power. When the mob came, and he was increasingly certain it would come, all he would be able to do was watch as his people were slaughtered. Unless there was something in those old books, those mystical texts, that could help. It started as a thought experiment. Late at night, in his private study, surrounded by towering stacks of books and scrolls, Rabbi Loew would light a single candle and open the Sefer Yetzirah. He would read the passages about creation, about the combinations of letters, about the power of the divine names. And he would think, if the ancient rabbis could do this, if the tradition says it is possible, could I? At first, he dismissed the idea immediately. It was absurd, dangerous, probably heretical. The creation of a golem was a theoretical exercise, not a practical solution to a political problem. But the thought kept returning, because the more he considered it, the more he realized that a golem was exactly what his community needed. They could not defend themselves with human strength. They were too few, and the law forbade it. But a golem would not be bound by those laws. It would not be human. It could not be killed or intimidated. It would be strong enough to physically block the narrow entrances to the Jewish quarter. It would be a guardian that felt no fear and needed no sleep. More than that, it would be a message, a demonstration of power, not violent, aggressive power, but the quiet, overwhelming power of something that simply could not be moved or stopped. A mob faced with a 7-foot creature of clay might think twice before attacking. But could he actually do it? Did he have the knowledge, the spiritual purity, the understanding of the deep secrets necessary to bring clay to life? And even if he could, should he? This was the question that tormented Rabbi Loew through the winter of 1590. He barely slept. He ate little. His wife and his students grew worried about him, but he would not explain what was troubling him. This was a burden he had to carry alone. He prayed for guidance. He fasted for days at a time, hoping for a sign, a dream, a message from heaven that would tell him what to do. And then came the crisis that forced his hand. The exact details vary depending on which version of the legend you read. But the essential story is this. A Christian child went missing in Prague, just disappeared one day, probably lost or run away, or perhaps the victim of some ordinary tragedy. But within hours, rumors began to spread through the Christian quarters. The Jews took the child. They were preparing for Passover, and they needed blood. The ritual murder was about to take place. Rabbi Loew heard about it from his contacts in the Christian community. There were a handful of Christian scholars who respected him and tried to warn him when trouble was brewing. And they told him, "This time is different. This time, the mob is larger. This time, the authorities are not going to intervene." He had perhaps a day, maybe two, before the mob would storm the Jewish quarter. A day to save his people. That night, Rabbi Loew did not sleep. He sat in his study, staring at the books before him, and he made his decision. He would create the golem, not because he wanted to, not because he was certain it was the right thing to do, but because the alternative, standing by and watching his people die, was unthinkable. He called for two of his most trusted disciples. One was his son-in-law, Isaac ben Simson, a brilliant scholar in his own right. The other was a devoted student named Jacob ben Chaim Sasson. He told them what he intended to do. He expected them to refuse, to tell him he was mad. But they did not refuse. They simply asked, "What do you need us to do?" According to Kabbalistic tradition, the creation of a golem requires 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Each must be represented. Rabbi Loew himself represented fire, the burning intelligence and spiritual force. Isaac represented water, the flow of life. Jacob represented air, the breath and spirit. And the clay they would shape would represent earth, the raw material of creation. They would need to purify themselves through prayer and fasting. They would need to choose the right time when the spiritual forces were properly aligned. And they would need to go to a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Rabbi Loew consulted his books and his calculations. The ritual had to be performed at midnight on the 20th of Adar in the Jewish calendar, just days away. And the place had to be the clay pits on the banks of the Vltava River, outside the city walls, where the boundary between water and earth was uncertain and mystical forces ran strong. The preparations began. For 3 days, the 3 men fasted and prayed. They purified themselves according to ancient rituals. They studied the specific letter combinations they would need to recite, and they prepared themselves mentally for what they were about to attempt, an act that would either save their community or damn their souls. On the night of the 20th of Adar, they slipped out of the Jewish quarter through a little used gate and made their way through the dark streets of Prague. The city was quiet, asleep, unaware of what was about to happen, and in the rabbi's heart, as he walked toward the river, was a prayer and a question that would echo through the centuries. God, forgive me, but if you will not send an angel to save us, then I will make one myself. The Vltava River runs through the heart of Prague like a dark ribbon, dividing the city in two. By day, it is beautiful, bridges arching over the water, the sun glinting off the surface. But at night, especially in early spring, when the winter's ice has just melted and the water runs cold and fast, it is a different world. A world of shadows and whispers. On the night of the 20th of Adar, sometime in late March or early April by the Christian calendar, 3 figures made their way along the riverbank, past the city walls, to a place where clay pits lay exposed at the water's edge. Rabbi Judah Loew led the way, a tall figure even in old age, his long grey beard catching the faint starlight. Behind him came his son-in-law Isaac and his student Jacob, each carrying a cloth sack with the ritual implements they would need: candles, prayer books, jars of specially purified water. They walked in silence. This was not a time for words. Each man was deep in prayer, deep in preparation, reaching for a level of spiritual focus that few humans ever achieve. They were about to attempt something that existed at the very edge of what Jewish mysticism said was possible. They reached the clay pits just as the midnight hour approached. The place was deserted. No one came here at night. The only sounds were the rush of the river and the occasional cry of a night bird. The air smelled of wet earth and cold water. Rabbi Loew stopped at a particular spot, a place where the clay was soft and clean, unspoiled by rocks or roots. He stood for a moment, looking down at the dark earth, and then he spoke for the first time since they had left the ghetto. "This is the place. We begin." The 3 men set down their sacks and lit 7 candles, arranging them in a specific pattern around a cleared space. The candlelight pushed back the darkness just enough to work by, but beyond the small circle of light, the night pressed in like a living thing. Then they began to dig. They used their bare hands, pulling up great handfuls of clay, piling it in the center of the circle. The clay was cold and wet, clinging to their fingers, getting under their nails. But they worked quickly, urgently, knowing that the ritual had to be completed within a specific window of time. And as they worked, Rabbi Loew began to recite passages from the Sefer Yetzirah in a low, rhythmic voice. Not the normal Hebrew used in daily prayer, but the ancient, mystical language of creation. He spoke of the 32 paths of wisdom. He spoke of the 10 Sephirot, the divine emanations through which God created the world. He spoke of the letters, the holy letters that were not just symbols, but the very building blocks of reality. When they had gathered enough clay, Rabbi Loew began to shape it. His hands moved with surprising strength for a man of his age, molding and forming, creating the crude outline of a human figure. A head, round and large, a thick neck, a massive torso, broad shoulders, powerful limbs. The proportions were not quite human. Everything was larger, heavier, more solid than a natural body. But slowly, unmistakably, the shape of a man emerged from the clay. Isaac and Jacob watched, assisting when directed, handing him more clay when needed, but mostly standing witness to this impossible act. It took hours. The candles burned down and they replaced them. The night deepened. The cold bit at their fingers, but they did not stop. And finally, just as the first hint of dawn began to grey the eastern sky, the figure was complete. It lay there on the ground, man-sized, no, larger than man-sized. At least 7 feet from head to toe, probably weighing as much as 3 normal men combined. The face was crude, the features barely suggested. 2 shallow depressions for eyes, a line for a mouth, no detail, no life. It was just clay, shaped into the form of a man. And now came the most dangerous part. Rabbi Loew directed Isaac and Jacob to take their positions. Isaac at the head of the clay figure, Jacob at the feet. Rabbi Loew himself stood at the right side. The 3 of them formed a triangle around their creation, with the candles still burning at specific points. "Remember what we studied," Rabbi Loew said quietly. "You must walk around the figure 7 times. I will lead. Follow my exact path. As we walk, recite the combinations I taught you. Do not make a mistake. Do not stop, no matter what you see or feel. Do you understand?" Both men nodded. Their faces were pale, exhausted from the night's work and the spiritual exertion, but their eyes were focused. "Then we begin." Rabbi Loew started to walk slowly clockwise around the clay figure, and the other 2 followed. As they walked, they chanted in unison, their voices low and rhythmic, speaking combinations of Hebrew letters that had no meaning in ordinary language but that, according to the Sefer Yetzirah, echoed the very process of creation itself. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. They completed the first circle. Nothing happened. The clay figure lay still and lifeless. He, Vav, Zion, Chet. The second circle. One of the candles flickered, as if in a breeze, though the air was perfectly still. Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed. The third circle. And now something was different. The clay was changing, not dramatically, not obviously, but if you looked closely, you could see the texture shifting. It was becoming less like raw earth and more like something else. Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin. The fourth circle. The clay was definitely warming. Rabbi Loew could feel it. A faint heat radiating from the figure. And the color was changing too, becoming less gray and more the color of flesh. Pei, Tzadi, Kof, Resh. The fifth circle, the chest. Was it rising? Just barely. as if the clay lungs were drawing in their first breath. Shin, Tav, the sixth circle. All three men could feel it now, a power building in the air around them, making their hair stand on end, making their skin prickle. The clay figure was changing before their eyes, transformation rippling across its surface like water. And then the seventh circle. Rabbi Loew completed his final step, and the three of them stopped, standing over the figure, breathing hard, chanting the final combinations of letters, not just letters now, but the secret names of God, the Shem HaMeforash, the 72-letter name that was said to contain the full power of creation. And then Rabbi Loew spoke one final word, a name he had never spoken before, a name that is not recorded in the legends because it is too holy, too dangerous to be written down. For a moment, nothing happened. The clay figure lay still, the candles burned. The three men stood, hearts pounding, wondering if it had all been for nothing, if the ancient texts had lied, if they had spent the night in a futile. The chest rose, not a little, not a gentle movement. It rose with a great shuddering breath, as if drowning lungs were suddenly pulling in air after minutes underwater. Jacob gasped and stumbled backward. Isaac grabbed Rabbi Loew's arm, but the rabbi stood firm, his eyes locked on the figure before him. A shudder ran through the clay body. The limbs twitched, and then, slowly, impossibly, the thing began to move. First the hands, fingers curling and uncurling as if testing themselves. Then the legs, shifting, bending at the knees. The head turned slightly, the crude face pointing upward toward the lightening sky. And then the eyes opened. They were not human eyes. There was no iris, no white, no hint of the organic structures that make up a human eye. They were simply hollow. Two dark openings that seemed to look at everything and nothing at the same time. Empty. Waiting. The golem sat up. The movement was awkward, mechanical, like a puppet being pulled by strings. But it was undeniably real. The thing was alive, or something like alive. It turned its head toward Rabbi Loew, and those empty eyes fixed on him. In that moment, the rabbi felt a fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the fear of death, but something deeper. The fear of having done something that could never be undone. The fear of having violated a boundary that was meant to keep the human and divine worlds separate. But he mastered the fear. He had come too far to turn back now. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small tablet of clay, no bigger than his palm. On it, he had carefully inscribed 3 Hebrew letters: AMT, Aleph, Mem, Tav, Emet, truth. According to the mystical tradition, this was the word that would bind the golem to life and to obedience. It was the seal that would make it serve. Rabbi Loew stepped forward. The golem remained still, watching him with those terrible, empty eyes. "By the power of the holy name," Rabbi Loew said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion and the fear, "I bind you to life. You will serve. You will obey. You will protect the people of Israel from all harm. Do you understand?" The golem did not speak, could not speak, but slowly, very slowly, it bowed its head in what might have been a nod. Rabbi Loew reached up. The thing was so tall that even seated it nearly matched his height. and pressed the clay tablet firmly against its forehead. The tablet seemed to merge with the clay flesh, becoming part of it, the 3 letters glowing faintly in the dawn light. "Stand," Rabbi Loew commanded. The golem stood. It rose to its full height, towering over the 3 men. In the growing light of dawn, they could see it clearly now. It looked almost human, but not quite. The proportions were wrong, the features were too crude, and there was something about the way it moved, too slow, too deliberate, that marked it as fundamentally different from any living creature. But it was strong. Even standing still, you could see the power in that massive frame. And it was obedient. It stood, waiting for the next command, like a loyal dog waiting for its master's word. Rabbi Loew circled the golem slowly, inspecting his creation. In the cold light of dawn, with the mystical atmosphere of the ritual fading, he could see what he had made. It was a monster. There was no other word for it, but it was their monster, and it would save them. "Come," Rabbi Loew said. "We must return before we are seen." They gave the golem a long coat to wear, covering as much of its strange body as possible, and a broad-brimmed hat to shadow its face. At a distance, in the early morning light, it might pass for a very large man. Might. The 4 of them, 3 men and 1 creature of clay, made their way back through the waking streets of Prague. A few early risers saw them and crossed themselves, thinking perhaps they had seen a ghost or a demon. But no one stopped them. They reached the Jewish quarter just as the sun broke over the rooftops. The gates were still locked, but Rabbi Loew had arranged for a trusted gatekeeper to let them in through a side entrance. They slipped inside, and the golem entered the world it would protect. The question was, could it be controlled? Or had Rabbi Loew, in his desperation, created something that would destroy the very people it was meant to save? For the first few days after the golem's creation, only a handful of people knew it existed. Rabbi Loew, Isaac, Jacob, and a few of the rabbi's most trusted confidants. The creature was kept hidden in the back rooms of the old new synagogue, given simple tasks to test its capabilities and its obedience. It could lift weights that would break a normal man's back. It could work for hours without rest or complaint. And most importantly, it obeyed every command instantly and without question. But it could not speak. It had no language, no voice. You gave it an instruction, and it carried it out with mechanical precision. Nothing more, nothing less. Rabbi Loew studied his creation carefully during those first days. He was looking for any sign of true intelligence, of independent thought, of something that might suggest a soul had formed inside the clay shell. But he found nothing. The golem was exactly what the text said it would be, an automaton, a tool, and yet there was something unsettling about it. The way those empty eyes would track movement, the way it would stand perfectly still for hours, not even swaying as if it were a statue, the way it would tilt its head slightly, as if listening to sounds no one else could hear. Rabbi Loew reminded himself, it is not alive, not truly. It is clay given temporary animation, nothing more. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he was not entirely convinced. The crisis that had prompted the golem's creation had not yet materialized. The missing Christian child had been found, alive and well, having simply run away from home, and the threat of the mob had dissipated. Rabbi Loew had, perhaps, created his guardian in vain, but he did not destroy it, because he knew the threat was not gone. It was only delayed. The blood libels would come again. The accusations would be made again, and next time he would be ready. He decided to reveal the Golem to the community leaders. On a Sabbath evening, after the congregation had left and the synagogue was empty, he gathered the elders and showed them what he had created. Their reactions ranged from awe to horror. Some saw the Golem as a miracle, a sign of God's protection manifested through their rabbi's holy wisdom. Others saw it as blasphemy, a violation of the natural order that would bring divine punishment down on their heads. But in the end, fear won out over principle. Because a week later, the crisis came. A Christian merchant named Thaddeus, a local demagogue known for his hatred of Jews, began spreading rumors through the Christian quarters of Prague. He claimed that his young niece had been seen near the Jewish quarter and had not returned home. He claimed he had witnesses who saw Jewish men dragging her into the ghetto. He claimed that Passover was coming and the Jews needed blood for their rituals. It was all lies. The girl had simply gone to visit a friend in another part of the city and had stayed longer than planned. But Thaddeus did not care about truth. He wanted violence. Within hours, a mob had formed. 50 men, 100 more. They armed themselves with clubs and torches, and they began marching toward the Jewish quarter, shouting for blood and vengeance. The sentries at the ghetto gates sent runners to Rabbi Loew. The message was simple: the mob is coming. We have perhaps 10 minutes. Rabbi Loew did not hesitate. He turned to the Golem, which had been standing silently in the corner of his study, as it always did. "Go to the main gate," he commanded. "Stand in the entrance. Let no one pass. Hurt no one unless they try to force their way through, but do not let them enter. Do you understand?" The Golem bowed its head and turned to leave. "Wait," Rabbi Loew called. The creature stopped. "Be careful. These are human beings created in God's image, even if they are filled with hatred. Do only what is necessary, nothing more." Again, the slight bow of the head, and then the Golem was gone, moving through the synagogue and out into the narrow streets of the ghetto. By the time it reached the main gate, the mob was already there. The Jewish gatekeepers had fallen back, terrified, knowing they could not hold against such numbers. The mob was pressing against the heavy wooden gates, their leaders calling for axes to break through, and then the gates opened. Not violently, not with a crash. They simply swung open, as if welcoming the mob inside. The men in front stumbled forward, surprised, raising their clubs, and stopped, because standing in the gateway, blocking the entire entrance with its massive frame, was the Golem. The mob's shouting died. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some of the men in the back, who could not see clearly, called out, "What is it? What's wrong?" But the men in front could not answer. They could only stare. The Golem stood perfectly still. Its arms hung at its sides. It made no threatening gestures, but its mere presence was threat enough. It was impossibly large, impossibly solid. And those who stood close enough to see its face, that crude, expressionless face with its empty eyes, felt a cold terror seep into their bones. One of the mob leaders, a blacksmith named Klaus, found his courage. He raised his club and shouted, "It's just one man! We are 100! Push through!" He charged forward and swung his club at the golem's head with all his strength. The club connected with a solid crack. It should have crushed bone, split skin, sent the creature reeling backward. Instead, the club shattered. The wood splintered like dry kindling, and Klaus stumbled, the handle still in his hand, staring at the golem in disbelief. The golem had not even flinched. Now it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it reached out with one massive hand and placed it against Klaus's chest. Not a strike, not a blow, just a push. A gentle push, as you might move a child away from a hot stove. Klaus flew backward as if he had been hit by a charging bull. He crashed into the men behind him, and they all went down in a tangle of limbs. The golem stepped forward, out of the gateway and into the street, and the mob fell back before it. Those in front tried to retreat, but the press of bodies behind them made it impossible. Panic was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The golem raised its arms, not in attack, but simply holding them out to the sides, making itself even larger, more imposing. And it began to walk forward, slowly, steadily, one step at a time. The mob broke. Men threw down their clubs and torches and ran. They trampled each other in their desperation to get away from this impossible thing. Within seconds, the entire crowd had scattered, fleeing down the streets, disappearing into the night. The golem stopped at the edge of the Jewish quarter, watching them go. Then it turned and walked calmly back through the gates, which closed behind it with a solid thunk. Inside the ghetto, hundreds of people had watched from windows and doorways, holding their breath, expecting at any moment to hear the sounds of massacre. Instead, there was only silence. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice. "Blessed be the Holy One." The cry was taken up by others. "Blessed be the Holy One. Blessed be the Maharal." Rabbi Loew, standing in the doorway of the synagogue, watched the golem approach. The creature's empty eyes met his own, and the rabbi felt a chill run down his spine, because for just a moment he thought he saw something in those eyes. Not intelligence exactly, but something. A satisfaction, perhaps. A sense of purpose fulfilled. Or perhaps he was imagining it. "You did well," he told the golem softly. "Go inside. Rest." The golem bowed its head and went into the synagogue. That night, no one in the Jewish quarter slept. They whispered to each other in the darkness, telling and retelling the story of what had happened. The Christian mob, so terrible and so certain, turned back by a single guardian. A creature of clay that could not be hurt, could not be stopped, could not be intimidated. For the first time in years, in decades, the Jews of Prague went to bed feeling safe. But Rabbi Loew did not feel safe. He felt afraid, because he had seen what the golem could do. He had seen the casual, effortless strength with which it had thrown a grown man like a rag doll, and he knew that he had given it a very simple command: protect, defend. But what exactly constituted a threat? Where was the line between protection and violence? The golem had been restrained tonight using minimal force, but would it always be so restrained? Or would there come a day when it decided, if such a thing could decide, that more extreme measures were necessary? These thoughts kept Rabbi Loew awake long into the night, and in the darkness of the synagogue, the golem stood motionless, tireless, those empty eyes staring at nothing, waiting for the next threat, waiting for the next command. The weeks that followed saw the golem become an accepted, if unsettling, part of life in the Jewish quarter. During the day, it performed simple tasks under Rabbi Loew's direction, carrying heavy loads, repairing buildings, doing work that would take 10 men. At night, it patrolled the ghetto, a silent guardian walking the narrow streets. News of the creature spread beyond the Jewish quarter. The Christian population of Prague heard wild stories of a Jewish demon, a monster, a giant summoned through dark magic. Some were afraid, others were skeptical, dismissing it as superstitious nonsense. But the threats stopped. The accusations did not stop. Thaddeus and others like him continued to spread their poison. But when it came time to form a mob, to march on the ghetto, men found excuses not to go, because they had heard the stories. They had heard about Klaus the blacksmith and his shattered club. They had heard about the thing that stood in the gateway, unmoved and unmovable, and they were afraid. For the Jewish community, this was a time of unprecedented peace. They went about their lives with a lightness they had not felt in years. Mothers let their children play in the streets without constant fear. Merchants opened their shops without wondering if this would be the day the mob came. The elderly, who had lived through pogroms, wept with relief. But Rabbi Loew grew more troubled with each passing day, because he was beginning to notice changes in the golem. Small changes, subtle changes, but changes nonetheless. It still obeyed every command instantly. But sometimes it would complete tasks that it had not been explicitly ordered to do, as if it were anticipating needs, as if it were learning. One evening, Rabbi Loew saw the golem standing in the synagogue courtyard, staring up at the stars. Just standing there, motionless, for nearly an hour. What did it see? What did it think, if it thought at all? Another time, a group of children were playing too close to a well, and the golem moved to physically block them from getting any closer. It had not been ordered to protect children specifically, but it had recognized danger and acted. And once, Rabbi Loew woke in the middle of the night to find the golem standing in his bedroom doorway, just standing there, watching him sleep. When the rabbi asked what it was doing, the golem simply turned and left without explanation, without any possibility of explanation, since it could not speak. These incidents worried Rabbi Loew deeply, because they suggested that the golem was developing beyond its original purpose, that there was something inside the clay shell that was growing, evolving, becoming more than it should be. Was it developing a soul? Jewish theology said that only God could create a true soul. But what if the animation of the golem had somehow attracted something, a fragment of spirit, a shadow of consciousness that was now inhabiting the clay? Or worse, what if the power that animated it was not holy at all? What if, in his desperation, Rabbi Loew had opened a door to something dark, and that darkness was now taking root inside his creation? He confided his fears to Isaac and Jacob. They assured him he was worrying needlessly. The golem had saved them. It continued to serve faithfully. What did it matter if it showed some signs of intelligence? Was that not a mark of the rabbi's great wisdom, that he had created something so sophisticated? But Rabbi Loew was not comforted, because he knew something his disciples did not. Every account of golem creation in the mystical texts ended the same way. The golem always had to be destroyed, not because it turned evil, not because it betrayed its creator, but because a golem, no matter how well-intentioned, was an abomination. It was unnatural. It was a violation of the boundary between human and divine. And the longer it existed, the more dangerous it became. Not dangerous because it wanted to cause harm, but dangerous because it did not understand limits, because it would follow its core purpose, protect, defend, to increasingly extreme conclusions. Rabbi Loew began to prepare himself for what he knew he would eventually have to do. He told no one, but he studied the texts, learned the method for unmaking a golem, for returning it to lifeless clay. All it would take was removing the letter Aleph from the word emet on its forehead, leaving met, death. One letter, one moment, and the guardian would fall, but not yet. As long as the golem remained under control, as long as it served its purpose without causing harm, he would let it continue. He should have acted sooner. Because on a Friday evening in late autumn, as the sun set and the Sabbath began, Rabbi Loew made a terrible mistake. In Jewish tradition, the Sabbath is sacred. From sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, all work ceases. All creation rests, echoing the seventh day when God rested from creating the universe. And that includes the golem. Rabbi Loew had established a ritual early on. Every Friday evening before the start of Sabbath, he would go to wherever the golem was and remove the shem, the clay tablet with the word emet from its forehead. This would deactivate the creature, reduce it to lifeless clay for the duration of the Sabbath. Then, after the Sabbath ended Saturday evening, he would replace the tablet and the golem would return to its duties. It was a necessary practice. Even a creature made for holy purposes could not violate the Sabbath. That would be a desecration beyond imagining. For months, this ritual had been performed without incident. Every Friday evening, the golem would bow its head, and Rabbi Loew would reach up and remove the Aleph, turning emet to met, truth to death. The creature would sway once, and then topple backward like a felled tree, becoming nothing more than a clay statue. But on this particular Friday, the date is usually given as the 21st of Tishrei in the year 5353 by the Jewish calendar, which would be autumn of 1592. Something went wrong. Rabbi Loew was old now, well into his 70s, perhaps even his 80s. The years of stress and responsibility had taken their toll, and on this Friday, he was exhausted from a long week of community disputes and study. As the afternoon wore on and Sabbath approached, he went about his usual preparations, overseeing the lighting of candles, the preparation of the Sabbath meal, the readying of the synagogue. And in the rush of preparations, he forgot. He forgot to deactivate the golem. The sun set. The Sabbath began. Rabbi Loew joined his family and the congregation in the synagogue for the Friday evening prayers. They sang the ancient melodies welcoming the Sabbath, the bride and queen of the week. The service was beautiful, peaceful, sacred. And in a back room of the synagogue, the golem stood, fully active, fully animated, on the holy Sabbath. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The golem simply stood as it always did, waiting for instruction. But as the hours passed and no instruction came, something changed. The legends differ on the exact sequence of events, but they all agree on the essential horror of what happened next. The golem began to move, not with the purposeful, directed movement it showed when following commands, but with something else, something erratic, almost frantic. It walked out of the synagogue into the darkening streets of the Jewish quarter. A few people saw it and waved, thinking nothing of it. The golem often patrolled the streets. But then it began to act strangely. It went to a building and simply pushed against the wall. Not violently at first, just pushing, testing, as if trying to understand its own strength. The wall cracked. The golem pushed harder. The wall collapsed inward with a crash of breaking stone and splintering wood. People came running to see what had happened. They called out to the golem, "What are you doing? Stop!" But the golem did not stop, could not stop, because there was no Rabbi Loew to command it, and it had no internal mechanism for stopping itself. It moved to another building. It reached up and tore the wooden shutters off the windows, ripping them away as easily as tearing paper. Then it began pulling at the roof tiles, sending them clattering into the street. Now people were shouting, running to get Rabbi Loew. But the rabbi was in the synagogue, deep in Sabbath prayers, and it was forbidden to interrupt. The golem's destruction escalated. It overturned a cart, scattering goods across the street. It pulled a door off its hinges. It went to the community well and began pulling at the stone rim, trying to lift it, as if the fundamental solidity of the world was something it needed to test and challenge. Some brave souls tried to approach it, to physically stop it, but the golem casually brushed them aside, sending them sprawling. It was not attacking people. It showed no aggression toward any human, but it was moving through the quarter like a force of nature, and anyone who got in its way was simply swept aside. The destruction spread. A wall here, a fence there, a building facade cracked and crumbling. The sounds of breaking wood and stone echoed through the normally peaceful Sabbath evening. And then, the golem did something that made the horror complete. It began to roar. It should not have been possible. The golem had no voice, no vocal cords, no capacity for sound. But from deep inside its clay chest came a sound like grinding stones, like wind howling through a canyon, like the earth itself screaming. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of something that was not meant to exist, expressing an anguish it should not have been able to feel. Inside the synagogue, Rabbi Loew heard the commotion. He tried to ignore it at first. One did not interrupt Sabbath prayers for anything short of life-threatening emergency, but the sounds grew louder, crashing, shouting, and then that terrible roar. He knew. His blood turned to ice. He knew exactly what had happened, what he had forgotten to do. Without a word, he stood and ran from the synagogue. Behind him, the congregation fell into confused silence. The rabbi violating Sabbath. What emergency could justify such a thing? Rabbi Loew burst out into the street and saw chaos. Buildings damaged, people cowering in doorways, and in the center of it all, the golem, his golem, the creature he had created to protect them, now destroying the very community it was meant to save. "Stop!" Rabbi Loew shouted, running toward it. "I command you, stop!" The golem turned at the sound of his voice, those empty eyes fixed on him. And for a moment, Rabbi Loew saw something in those eyes that turned his bowels to water. Not malice, not hatred, but something worse. Confusion, pain, a terrible, inarticulate need that the golem could not express and could not understand. It had been made to serve, to obey, to have purpose. But now there was no command, no direction, no purpose. And that absence had become a kind of torment. The golem was acting out not from evil, but from a kind of existential agony, the pain of a thing that should not exist, trying desperately to understand why it does. "Please," Rabbi Loew said, approaching slowly now, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The golem stood still, that crude face turned toward him. And Rabbi Loew could swear, though he knew it was impossible, that the thing was crying, not tears. It had no eyes that could produce tears. But there was a wetness on the clay face, as if the material itself was weeping. Rabbi Loew knew what he had to do, what he should have done months ago perhaps, what he should never have hesitated to do. He reached up. The golem was so tall, he could barely reach its forehead, and his fingers found the word carved there, emet, truth. "Forgive me," the rabbi whispered. "Forgive me for creating you. Forgive me for making you carry this burden." And with one quick motion, he scraped away the letter Aleph. Emet became met, truth became death. The golem shuddered. A ripple passed through its entire body, like a wave moving through water. The crude features seemed to soften, the tension leaving them. And for just an instant, just a single heartbeat, Rabbi Loew could swear the empty eyes looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. Then the golem toppled. It fell backward like a great tree cut down, hitting the cobblestones with a crash that shook the ground. And as it fell, the animation left it. The color drained from the clay. The texture changed from something almost flesh-like back to simple, lifeless earth. By the time it hit the ground, it was just a clay statue, a crude sculpture of a man, nothing more. Rabbi Loew fell to his knees beside it, his hand still raised, trembling. Around him, the people of the Jewish quarter emerged from their homes, staring in silence at the fallen guardian. Someone began to cry, then others, not just from fear of what had happened, but from loss. Because whatever the golem had been, whatever unsettling presence it had carried, it had also been their protector, their shield, the one thing that had made them feel safe. And now it was gone. Rabbi Loew looked up at the gathered crowd, at the damaged buildings, at the faces filled with fear and confusion and grief. "It's over," he said simply. "It's over." In the days that followed, the Jewish quarter began the work of repair, not just of the buildings the golem had damaged, but of the community's understanding of what had happened. Rabbi Loew addressed the community in the synagogue. He explained his error. He explained why the golem could not be allowed to continue existing. And he explained what would now happen to it. The clay body would be carried to the attic of the old new synagogue. It would be laid to rest there, hidden, sealed away. No one would be permitted to enter the attic. No one would be permitted to see what remained of the golem. It would stay there, entombed in the darkness, until such time as God himself decided what should be done with it. And most importantly, Rabbi Loew made them swear, never again. No matter how dire the threat, no matter how desperate the situation, they must never attempt to recreate the golem. He would not teach the method to anyone. The knowledge would die with him, because he had learned what he should have known from the beginning. There are powers that humans should not wield, no matter how righteous the cause. There are lines that should not be crossed, no matter how desperate the need. The creation of life belongs to God alone. Several men, Isaac, Jacob, and a few others, carried the clay body up the narrow stairs to the synagogue attic. It was difficult work. Even as lifeless clay, The golem was immensely heavy, but they managed, and they laid it in a corner, covering it with old prayer shawls and forgotten religious texts. Rabbi Loew himself closed and sealed the attic door. Then he decreed, the stairs leading to the attic would be removed, the entrance would be locked, and from this day forward, no one, not rabbis, not scholars, not caretakers, would be permitted to enter. The golem would remain there, hidden in darkness, neither truly alive nor truly destroyed. Waiting. The question no one dared to ask was, waiting for what? Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel died in the year 1609, at the age of somewhere between 89 and 97. Even his exact age is uncertain. He was laid to rest in the old Jewish cemetery of Prague, and his grave became a site of pilgrimage. To this day, visitors leave small stones on his tombstone as a mark of respect. He lived for nearly 20 years after the golem's deactivation, and in those years, he continued to teach, to write, to serve his community with wisdom and compassion. But those who knew him well said he was never quite the same after that Sabbath evening. Something in him had changed. There was a sadness, a weight that he carried until his death. He never spoke publicly about the golem again, never wrote about it in his scholarly works, never mentioned it in his sermons. It was as if he wanted the whole episode to simply fade away, to be forgotten. But of course, it was not forgotten. The legend of the golem spread. It was told and retold, embellished and mythologized. Within a few generations, it had become one of the most famous Jewish folk tales, a story told in every Jewish community across Europe. The details changed with each telling, the exact date of creation, the specific reasons, the nature of the golem's rampage. But the core remained the same. A rabbi, desperate to save his people, created life from clay, and the creation, no matter how good its purpose, ultimately could not be controlled. The old new synagogue stands to this day. It survived the medieval pogroms. It survived the 30 Years' War. It miraculously survived World War II. The Nazis destroyed almost every other building in the Jewish quarter, but the synagogue remained untouched. Some say it was protected by the golem. Others say it was simply luck. The attic remains sealed. The stairs were never rebuilt. The door is locked, and by rabbinical decree, no one is permitted to open it. And yes, there are stories that during World War II, as the Nazis marched through Prague, they heard rumors of the Jewish demon in the synagogue. They sent soldiers to find it, to destroy it. But the soldiers who went up to the attic came back down pale and shaking, refusing to speak about what they had seen. And after that, the Nazis left the synagogue alone. Are the stories true? Is there really something in that attic, covered in centuries of dust, waiting? The official position of the Prague Jewish community is that the golem legend is just that, a legend, a story. There is nothing in the attic but old books and forgotten furniture, but they still won't let anyone go up there to check. The legend of the golem has had a profound impact on Western culture. It is, arguably, the original creation rebels against creator story. Mary Shelley was certainly familiar with Jewish folklore when she wrote Frankenstein in 1818, and the parallels are clear. A scientist who creates life through forbidden knowledge, a creature that begins with good intentions but becomes dangerous, a creator destroyed by guilt and the consequences of playing God. Every robot story, every artificial intelligence narrative, every tale of humans creating something they cannot control, they all trace their lineage back to the Golem of Prague. But the Jewish understanding of the Golem goes deeper than just a cautionary tale about technology. In Jewish thought, the Golem is a meditation on several profound themes. The nature of humanity. What makes us human? The Golem had a body like ours, could move and act like us, but it lacked something essential, speech, perhaps, or free will, or a soul. It reminds us that being human is more than just having a human shape. The limits of human power. Rabbi Loew was a brilliant scholar, arguably the greatest of his age. But even he could not create true life. He could only make a pale imitation, a shadow of the real thing. There are things that belong to God alone, and humans overstep those boundaries at their peril. The price of protection. The Golem was created for the most righteous of reasons, to protect innocent people from genocide. But even righteous purposes can lead to terrible consequences if we use the wrong means. The ends do not always justify the means, even when the ends are survival itself. The tragedy of Rabbi Loew is that he was not a villain. He was not a mad scientist drunk on his own power. He was a good man, a holy man, faced with an impossible choice: watch his people die, or violate the fundamental laws of nature to save them. He chose to save them, and he succeeded. The Jewish community of Prague survived, but the cost was his own peace of mind, his own spiritual well-being. He carried the weight of what he had done for the rest of his life. The question the legend asks us is this: if you were in his position, what would you do? If the mob was at your gate, if the people you loved were about to be slaughtered, if you had the knowledge and the power to create a guardian that could save them, would you have the wisdom to say no? Would you have the strength to accept that there are some powers humans should not wield, even to save lives? Or would you, like Rabbi Loew, reach for the clay? Because that is the true horror at the heart of the Golem legend. Not that the creature became dangerous, not that it had to be destroyed, but that we understand completely and perfectly why it was created in the first place. We understand the desperation. We understand the logic. We understand the love and the fear and the desperate need to protect that drove a holy man to commit an unholy act. And we understand that, in his position, we might do exactly the same thing. The Golem is not just a Jewish legend, it is a human legend. Because every culture, every age, has faced the question of how far we will go to protect what we love. Every generation has been tempted to reach for power that should not be wielded. Every era has had its own version of the clay, some technology, some weapon, some knowledge that promises to solve our problems, but carries with it terrible, unforeseen costs. In our own time, we create artificial intelligence, manipulate genes, split atoms, and reshape the climate itself. We tell ourselves that we are doing it for good reasons, to cure disease, to feed the hungry, to protect the innocent. And perhaps we are right. Perhaps this time we can wield these powers responsibly. Perhaps this time the Golem will not turn on us. But the legend is there to remind us: be careful, be very, very careful, because the clay in the attic is still waiting. And perhaps in the end, that is where it belongs, hidden away in darkness, sealed behind locked doors, preserved not as something to be used, but as something to be remembered, a warning from our ancestors about the price of playing God. The legend says that when the Messiah comes, when the age of redemption begins, the Golem will finally be granted rest. Its clay will be returned to the earth from which it came. And Rabbi Loew, whose soul has been waiting all this time, will finally be forgiven for what he created. Until then, the attic remains sealed, the door remains locked, and in the darkness above the ancient synagogue, something that is neither alive nor dead waits patiently for the end of days. This has been the Midnight Archives. Keep the candle lit.